Welcome to Trust Test. Hubie stepped through the entrance of the country club 3 weeks back, dressed in a suit I'd purchased just for this occasion. Not borrowed, not rented, actually bought. My parents were celebrating 4 decades of marriage. It was important to them. Their social circle would be there. The entire extended family, too. My plan was straightforward. Arrive, maintain a pleasant expression throughout, make an early departure. My mother spotted me initially. She genuinely gasped, exclaiming loud enough for others to hear that she was shocked I'd actually appeared. She immediately turned to her companions and informed them they each needed to pay her $20. 20 actual dollars. There had been wagering on whether I possessed enough courage to show my face. The room erupted in laughter as if this was the most hilarious thing imaginable. My father rose before the assembled guests, beverage in hand, and proclaimed that standing before them was their disappointment. Gesturing directly at me, 36 years old and still using a futon as a bed, my brother immediately contributed his own commentary, mentioning how I continued using public transportation like a teenager. My sister added that they'd been informing acquaintances I was incarcerated because it sounded more respectable than being jobless once again. Additional laughter filled the space. My mother addressed her book club associates, sharing that I'd recently submitted an application for fast food employment. At my age, she emphasized repeatedly, as though I were some failed experiment. My uncle projected his voice across the venue, announcing that his nephew earned $11 hourly. 11. He repeated the figure to ensure maximum audience awareness. My aunt stage whispered with deliberate volume that my suit wasn't authentic, that the price tag remained attached, that I clearly intended to return it the following day. Everyone found this uproarious. Then my father's employer, present as an invited guest, inquired if I was the one residing in that basement dwelling. My father confirmed and clarified that it wasn't even a legitimate apartment, merely a basement. Universal hilarity ensued. I remained seated at the table they'd positioned me at near the back corner, maintained my smile, consumed my chicken, and remained silent throughout. Here's the information nobody at that gathering possessed. Here's what makes this entire situation far better than they could comprehend. I don't reside in any basement. I haven't lived in a basement for 4 years. I own a condominium that's completely paid off. I don't use public transportation due to inability to afford a vehicle. I utilize public transit because I sold my automobile 2 years prior, after realizing it was unnecessary, and the insurance represented wasted capital I could invest instead. I don't sleep on any futon. I have a proper bed like any functioning adult. And regarding that job application my mother referenced, I never submitted anything anywhere. She fabricated that detail, or she's confusing me with another person, or she simply wanted additional material for mockery. The reason they believe all these falsehoods about me stems from 6 years ago when I genuinely was struggling. I'd become unemployed. I was staying on various couches. I was in complete disarray. They were terrible about it during that period too. Every family meal became an interrogation regarding my shortcomings. Every phone conversation became a lecture. Every text message became criticism, so I ceased providing them with any information. When I recovered my footing, when I secured stable employment, when I began saving and making investments, when I purchased my residence, I didn't inform them. What would be the purpose? They'd already determined my identity. I allowed them to believe whatever they wished. I wore old clothing to family gatherings. I maintained my hair slightly longer than conventional. I complained about rent I wasn't actually paying. I referenced bus schedules and budget grocery shopping. I performed the role they'd written for me because it was simpler than challenging their narrative and because somewhere in my mind, I knew this day would arrive. The day they'd require something from me. The day their story about pathetic me would collide with reality. That day arrived approximately 16 hours after the party concluded. My phone began receiving constant notifications. First my mother, then my father, then my brother, then my sister, then both my uncle and aunt. Message after message, call after call. 312 messages when I finally tallied them. Requests to answer. Statements that they were completely in trouble. Apologies. Demands that I respond. Declarations that this was serious. Admissions they'd made mistakes, please. I didn't respond. I observed the messages accumulating and felt absolutely nothing except an unusual sense of satisfaction. They were panicking. Genuinely panicking. The variety of panic that comes from realizing you've just publicly demolished your relationship with the singular person who could assist you. See, What nobody mentioned at that party was the reason they could even afford hosting it at that country club. The reason they could afford their house. The reason my father's enterprise hasn't collapsed. 8 years ago, when I was actually doing well before everything fell apart for me, I co-signed their business loan. My father needed it for expansion. The bank wouldn't approve him without additional signature due to some credit complications he'd experienced. I was young, foolish, and wanted to help my parents. So I signed. Then I experienced my difficult period. I stopped communicating with them as frequently. They stopped inquiring about my life except to criticize it. The loan somewhat faded into the background. I assumed they were making their payments, managing their business, whatever. I had my own problems. What I didn't know until 2 days before their anniversary party was that my father had been making partial payments for the past year. The business was struggling. He'd been juggling finances, robbing Peter to pay Paul, barely keeping afloat. And the bank had finally reached their limit. They wanted their money, the full amount, and since I was the co-signer, they wanted it from me if my father couldn't pay. I discovered this because the bank contacted me. Not my father, the bank. Apparently they'd been attempting to reach my father for weeks, and he'd been avoiding them. So they proceeded to me, the co-signer, the backup plan, the person legally responsible for this debt if the primary borrower couldn't manage it. The amount was substantial. Not quite 6 figures, but close enough that it would devastate most people's finances. For my father's business, it meant bankruptcy. For their house, which they'd refinanced to invest money into the business, it meant foreclosure. For their entire existence, it meant losing everything they'd built over 4 decades. I informed the bank I'd require several days to review the documentation and determine my options. They granted me 2 weeks. That was 3 weeks ago. The party occurred right in the middle of that 2-week window. I attended knowing exactly what situation they were experiencing. I attended knowing that they had no awareness I knew. I attended knowing that any day now they'd have to inform me. They'd have to request help. They'd have to admit they needed their disappointment. And then they humiliated me before everyone they knew. They mocked me, laughed at me, made me the punchline of their anniversary celebration. They wagered money on whether I'd appear. They called me a failure to their friends. They invented stories about fast food applications and returned suits. They ensured every single person in that room understood that I was the family embarrassment. So now they're panicking because the bank's deadline is approaching rapidly, because my father finally had to admit to my mother what was happening, because they realize that I'm the co-signer and they need me to either help them pay or at least cooperate with whatever solution they're attempting to arrange, because somewhere in their desperate brainstorming session, someone probably pointed out that they just spent an entire evening publicly destroying any goodwill I might have had remaining. The messages continue arriving. My brother sent me an extended text about how it was just jokes, how everyone was just having fun, how I'm being overly sensitive. My sister called me 6 consecutive times and left voicemails saying we need to discuss the family situation. It's urgent. Please call back. My mother's texts have transitioned from demanding to pleading. My father hasn't texted at all, which is somehow worse. I'm not responding. Not yet. Let them panic. Let them wonder. Let them feel exactly as powerless and humiliated as they made me feel sitting at that back table listening to a room full of people laugh at my fabricated failures. They want to discuss the family situation now. Certainly we can discuss it, but it's going to be on my terms. And those terms are going to be very, very different from what they're anticipating. Because here's the thing. They don't understand yet. I've been waiting for this. Not specifically this situation, but something like it. Some moment when they need me and have to face who I actually am versus who they decided I was. I've spent 6 years building a life they know nothing about. I've spent 6 years letting them believe their story while I wrote my own. And now their story has crashed into reality and they're realizing way too late that they bet on the wrong son. So yeah, my phone's exploding. My family's freaking out, and I'm sitting here in my paid-off condo, reading their desperate messages and planning exactly what comes next. All right, so the silence lasted 5 days. 5 beautiful days of watching my phone illuminate with increasingly desperate messages while I went about my normal life. Work, gym, groceries, evening walks. Just living my actual life that none of them know exists. The messages got progressively more unhinged. My mother went from demanding to begging to angry to begging again. She sent me texts saying I was being childish, that family doesn't hold grudges, that she didn't raise me to be petty. Pretty rich coming from the woman who took literal bets on whether I'd show up to their party. My brother tried the sibling angle, saying we needed to stick together, that he was just going along with the jokes because everyone else was laughing. My sister sent voice messages crying about how scared my mother was, how my father wasn't sleeping, how I was tearing the family apart over a few jokes. A few jokes. That's what they were calling it. A few jokes. My uncle sent exactly one text. It said the family needed me to step up and be a man about this. I actually laughed out loud at that one. The same uncle who announced my hourly wage to a room full of strangers wanted to lecture me about being a man. But the really interesting development came from my father. He didn't text. He didn't call. Instead, he showed up at my old basement apartment, the one I haven't lived in for 4 years. He knocked on the door for 20 minutes. According to my former landlord, who I'm still friendly with and who texted me about this weird situation, my father apparently told the current tenant that he was looking for his son, that there was a family emergency, that he really needed to find me. The tenant, bless him, said he'd never heard of me and closed the door. My father then tried to leave a note. My old landlord intercepted him in the hallway and explained that I'd moved out years ago, that he had no forwarding address, that maybe my father should try calling me like a normal person. My father apparently got very upset and said I wasn't answering his calls, that this was urgent, that he needed to find me immediately. My old landlord, who knows exactly where I live now but isn't about to share that information, suggested my father try social media. My father doesn't do social media, never has. Too old-fashioned for that. This whole situation told me everything I needed to know. They were desperate enough to hunt me down in person, but not desperate enough to actually confront what they'd done. They wanted to find me, corner me, pressure me in person because they thought that would work better than phones. They were strategizing, planning, trying to figure out the best way to manipulate me into helping them. So I decided to respond, but on my terms, my timeline, my rules. I texted my mother first. Simple message. Said I'd been busy with work and just saw all the messages. Asked what was so urgent, played completely oblivious. She called within 30 seconds. I didn't answer. Let it go to voicemail. She left a 7-minute message that was basically a verbal breakdown. She said my father was in serious trouble, that there were problems with the business loan, that they needed family to pull together right now, that she knew I'd been going through a hard time, but this was bigger than whatever issues I was having. She said they could explain everything if I'd just come over for dinner. She said my sister was making my favorite meal. She said please at least 4 times, my favorite meal, like that was going to be the thing that convinced me. Like pot roast would erase the memory of being called a disappointment in front of 50 people. I waited 2 hours and texted back. Said I couldn't do dinner, but I could meet my father at the hardware store on Morrison Street on Saturday afternoon. 2 o'clock, public place, neutral ground. Not their house where they could gang up on me. Not a restaurant where they could make a scene. A hardware store where people were focused on their own projects and wouldn't notice or care about family drama. My mother texted back immediately asking why not dinner, why a hardware store, why Saturday when this was so urgent. I didn't respond, just left her on read. Saturday came. I got there at 2:15, made him wait. My father was standing near the lumber section looking completely out of place in his dress shoes and button-down shirt. He's never been a home improvement guy, couldn't tell you the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. Seeing him there, obviously uncomfortable, waiting for me, it was almost satisfying enough on its own. He saw me and immediately started walking over. I held up my hand and gestured for him to follow me to the garden section. More space, fewer people. He looked confused but followed. We stood between the fertilizer and the potting soil. The spring planting season was ramping up, so there were a few other customers around, but nobody close enough to hear us clearly. Perfect. My father started talking before I could say anything. He said he was glad I agreed to meet, that we needed to discuss the business situation, that there had been some complications with the loan. He said it like I didn't already know, like the bank hadn't already told me everything, like I hadn't spent the last 3 weeks preparing for exactly this conversation. I asked him what kind of complications. Let him explain it. Let him admit it out loud. He fumbled through an explanation about cash flow issues and unexpected expenses and the bank being unreasonable about payment terms. He said he'd been trying to work something out, but they were pushing for full payment. He said he needed to know if I'd be willing to help as the co-signer, maybe vouch for him with the bank, maybe help restructure the loan. I just stared at him. Didn't say anything. Let the silence stretch out. He kept talking. Said he knew things had been tense between us lately. Lately, like 6 years was lately. He said the anniversary party got a little out of hand, that everyone had been drinking, that families joke around and I shouldn't take it so personally. He said my mother was really worried about me taking offense when none was meant. None was meant. $20 bets, public mockery, invented stories about fast food applications, but none was meant. I asked him if he thought I was still living in that basement. He blinked. Said what? I repeated the question. Did he actually think I was still living in that basement apartment? He said he didn't know where I was living, that I'd been so private about my life lately that I never told him anything anymore. He said it like it was my fault, like I was the one who created this distance. I asked him why he thought that was. Why did he think I stopped telling them things? He got defensive, said families go through rough patches, that I'd been dealing with my own problems and they'd tried to be supportive, but I pushed them away. He said they'd only ever wanted what was best for me. I asked him if publicly humiliating me was what was best for me, if betting on whether I'd show up was supportive, if announcing to his boss that I lived in a basement was trying to help. He said I was twisting things, that it wasn't like that everyone was just having fun at the party and I was making it into something it wasn't. He said I'd always been too sensitive, too quick to take offense, that I needed to learn to laugh at myself. There it was. The core of it. I'd always been too sensitive. This had always been my problem, not theirs. They weren't cruel. I was just too weak to handle normal family dynamics. This was their story, and they'd been telling it so long they believed it completely. I told him I wasn't living in a basement. I owned a condo, paid off, had for 3 years. I told him I didn't take the bus because I couldn't afford a car. I took it because I sold my car and invested the money. I told him I hadn't applied to any fast food jobs. I had a regular job. Had it for 4 years, made decent money, saved aggressively, invested intelligently. He stared at me like I was speaking a different language. His face went through several expressions. Confusion, disbelief, something that might have been anger. He said, why didn't I tell them any of this? Why did I let them think I was struggling if I wasn't? I asked him why it mattered. Why did they need to know the details of my life when all they ever did was criticize and mock whatever I told them? I asked him what they would have done differently if they'd known. Would they have respected me more? Would they have treated me better? Or would they have just found different things to pick apart and ridicule? He didn't have an answer for that. Just stood there looking at me like he was seeing a stranger. I told him I'd think about the loan situation, that I needed time to review my options and figure out what made sense financially, that I'd get back to him when I'd made my decision. He said they didn't have much time. The bank's deadline was in 9 days. He said they could lose everything if I didn't help. The business, the house, everything they'd built over 4 decades. I said I understood that. I said I'd be in touch. Then I walked away. Left him standing there in the garden section between the fertilizer and the potting soil. I got about halfway to my car when my phone rang. My mother, I answered. She was crying. Said my father had just called her, that she couldn't believe what I told him, that I'd been lying to them for years about my living situation. She said she didn't understand why I would do that, why I would let them worry about me when I was apparently fine. She said it was cruel, manipulative, that I'd made them look like fools. I asked her if she remembered the anniversary party. She said of course she did. I asked her if she remembered the bet, the jokes, the public mockery, the way everyone laughed. She said that was different. That was just family fun, that everyone teases each other, that I was being dramatic. I asked her how much she won on the bet. She went quiet. I asked again. How much did she win betting that I wouldn't show up to my parents' anniversary party? She said it wasn't like that. It was just a silly thing. She said she'd actually bet that I would show up because she had faith in me. She said I was twisting everything around to make them look bad. I told her the bank's deadline was in 9 days and I'd let them know my decision before then. She started talking faster, saying we needed to sit down as a family, that we needed to work this out together. That blood was thicker than water and family helped family. I asked her where that family loyalty was when she was telling her friends I'd applied to work fast food. She said that was just conversation, that she was worried about me, that mothers talk about their children and sometimes they embellish because they're stressed. I told her I'd be in touch and hung up. My phone has been going absolutely crazy since then. My brother texting saying I'm being unreasonable. My sister calling crying about how I'm destroying the family. My uncle sending hostile messages about how I'm letting pride ruin everyone's lives. Even my aunt weighed in saying I should consider how this is affecting my mother's health and stop being selfish. But here's the thing. I spent 6 years being their punching bag. 6 years letting them believe a story about me that wasn't true because it was easier than fighting. 6 years building a life they knew nothing about while they mocked a version of me that didn't exist, and now they need something from me, and they're furious that I'm not immediately rolling over and giving it to them. They don't want to apologize. They want me to forget. They don't want to acknowledge what they did. They want me to prioritize their emergency over my dignity. They want the family dynamics to go back to normal where they can treat me however they want, and I just take it because that's my role. But I'm done playing that role. And they're starting to realize that I hold all the cards here. The bank deadline is in 8 days now, and I still haven't decided what I'm going to do. The family intervention meeting happened on Wednesday, 4 days before the bank deadline. I didn't agree to it. They just showed up at my actual condo. Yeah, they found me. Turns out my sister had hired someone to track me down. Not a private investigator or anything dramatic like that. Just some guy she knew from her gym who did skip tracing on the side. Gave him my name and old address, and he found my current place in about 6 hours. She was very proud of this when she told me later. Like stalking me was some kind of accomplishment. I was making dinner when the buzzer went off. Building intercom. The doorman said I had visitors. My parents, brother, and sister. All 4 of them. Did I want them sent up? I could have said no. Could have told the doorman to send them away. But honestly, I was curious. Curious to see what they'd do when confronted with actual evidence that I wasn't the person they'd been mocking for 6 years. Curious to see if they'd apologize, now that they were standing in my building looking at proof of my real life. So I said, send them up. They got off the elevator and I was standing in my doorway watching them take in the hallway. The nice carpet, the good lighting, the kind of building that costs real money to live in. My mother's face went through about 5 different expressions before she settled on confused. My father just looked tired. My brother was trying to play it cool, but I could see him doing the mental math. How much does a place like this cost? How has his younger brother been living here while we all thought he was in a basement? My sister looked almost angry, like I'd personally wronged her by having a nicer place than she expected. I let them in. Didn't offer them anything to drink. Just stood there in my living room with my paid-off furniture and my decent TV and my actual adult life on display. My mother started. She said they needed to talk as a family about the situation, that things had gotten out of hand, that everyone was stressed and saying things they didn't mean. She was trying to take control of the conversation before it even started. Set the narrative. Make this about everyone being stressed rather than about what they'd actually done. I asked them why they were really here. My father said they'd been trying to reach me about the loan for over a week now, that the deadline was approaching, that they needed to know if I was going to help. Help. That word. Like this was a normal family favor. Like I was being asked to help them move furniture or watch their dog. I said I'd been thinking about it, and I had some questions first. Questions about why they thought I'd be willing to help them after what happened at the party. My brother jumped in. Said we needed to separate the personal stuff from the business stuff. That the loan was a legal obligation I'd signed up for 8 years ago. That whatever happened at the party was unrelated to my responsibilities. As a co-signer, he was trying to make it logical, clinical. Remove the emotion so they could pressure me with legal obligation instead. I asked him if he remembered what he said at the party about me taking the bus like a 16-year-old. He said, yeah, it was a joke. Everyone was making jokes. I asked him if he actually believed I took the bus because I couldn't afford a car, or if he just said it because it got a laugh. He didn't answer for a second. Then he said he didn't know what I did for transportation, that I never told anyone anything about my life, that if I'd been honest with them, they wouldn't have had to guess. There it was. The blame shift. This was my fault for being private, my fault for not sharing, my fault they'd invented an entire false narrative about my life and then mocked me for it publicly. My sister said they wouldn't have worried so much if they'd known I was doing okay. She was trying the concerned angle, the caring sister routine. She said my mother had been losing sleep over me for years, that they'd all been worried about me struggling, that finding out I was actually fine this whole time felt like a betrayal, I asked her how I betrayed them by not telling them about my life when every time I had told them anything, they used it against me. She said that wasn't fair. That families give each other a hard time sometimes, but it comes from love. Love. She actually said that. Betting $20 on whether I'd show up came from love. Telling people I was in jail came from love. Mocking my fake poverty to a room full of strangers came from love. My father finally spoke up. He said they didn't come here to rehash the party. They came to discuss the loan. He said he understood I was upset about some things, but there were bigger issues at stake here. His business. Their house. 40 years of work on the line. I asked him why he thought I should care. He stared at me. Said because I was family. Because that's what family does. They help each other when it matters. I asked him when they'd helped me. When I was actually struggling 6 years ago, couch surfing, barely surviving. When I needed family support and all I got was lectures and criticism and constant reminders of how I was failing. Where was the family help then? My mother said they did help. They let me stay with them for 2 weeks. They gave me money. They tried to connect me with job opportunities. She was listing things like she was building a case. Like their minimal assistance 6 years ago meant I owed them whatever they wanted now. I pointed out that the 2 weeks I stayed with them involved daily interrogations about what I was doing wrong with my life. That the money she mentioned was $200 that came with a lecture about budgeting. That the job opportunities were my father asking his friends if they needed someone to do menial labor. I said they didn't help me. They humiliated me while I was at my lowest and then patted themselves on the back for being supportive. My brother said I was rewriting history. That they'd done what they could and I was ungrateful. He said the problem was that I'd always been too proud to accept help. Too stubborn to listen to advice. That I'd rather struggle alone than let family guide me. I asked him if that's really what he thought, or if that's just the story they all told themselves to feel better about how they treated me. He said I was being defensive, that I couldn't accept any criticism without making them into villains. This is what I'd been waiting for. This moment where they all stood in my living room looking at proof that I'd built a successful life without them and still insisted the problem was me. Still insisted I was too sensitive. Too proud, too stubborn, still refused to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong about me. So I told them I'd made my decision about the loan. They all went quiet, leaned forward, waiting. I said I'd reviewed the paperwork carefully over the past few weeks. I'd talked to a lawyer, I'd looked at my options as a co-signer, and I'd discovered some interesting things. My father's face changed. He knew. He knew what I was about to say. I told them that as the co-signer, I wasn't just on the hook if my father defaulted. I actually had equal legal standing with the original borrower, which meant I could negotiate directly with the bank. I could propose restructuring. I could even, if I wanted to, take over the loan entirely. My mother asked what that meant. I explained that it meant I could pay off my father's debt and the loan would transfer to me. The business would be safe. The house would be safe. Everything they were worried about losing would be protected. My sister actually smiled. Said, "See, we knew you'd help. We knew family would come through. I wasn't finished." I said if I did that, if I took over the loan, I wouldn't just be doing them a favor. I'd be taking ownership. The loan was secured against the business and the house. If I paid it off, I'd have legal claim to those assets until I was repaid in full. The business would effectively be operating under my oversight. The house would have my name on it alongside theirs. The room went dead silent. My father said that wasn't how it worked, that I couldn't just take over. I showed him the paperwork I'd gotten from my lawyer. The co-signer agreement he'd signed 8 years ago had very specific language about transfer of obligation and secured interests. My brother grabbed the papers and started reading. His face went pale. He asked if this meant I'd own part of the business. I said not own exactly, but I'd have controlling interest until the debt was settled. Any major business decisions would require my approval. Any attempt to sell assets would need my sign-off. My uncle, who apparently had been waiting in the hallway because my sister had texted him to come up for backup, walked in right at this moment. He demanded to know what was going on. My sister explained that I was trying to take over my father's business, that I was using the loan situation to steal from family. I corrected her. I wasn't stealing anything. I was offering to solve their problem, but solving it had a price. That price was control, oversight, accountability. All the things they'd never wanted to give me because they'd never respected me enough to think I deserved them. My uncle started yelling, said I had no right to hold the business hostage, that this was extortion, that my father had built that business from nothing and I was trying to profit off his hard work. I asked him if he remembered what he said at the party about my hourly wage. He told me to get over it. That was weeks ago. This was about the family's future. I said no. This was about consequences. About 6 years of mockery and humiliation catching up with them all at once. About them betting against me and losing. About them treating me like garbage and then being shocked when I didn't immediately volunteer to save them. My mother started crying. Real tears this time, not manipulation. She said she didn't understand how I could be so cruel, how I could watch them lose everything over hurt feelings. She said she'd never raised me to be vindictive like this. I asked her if she raised me to be their entertainment at parties, to be the punchline of family jokes, to be the cautionary tale she told her friends about. She said that wasn't fair, that I was taking everything out of context. My father finally spoke again, asked what I wanted, what would make me just help them without all these conditions. What would make this go away? I told him nothing would make it go away. This wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology or a conversation. They'd spent 6 years deciding who I was, creating a story about me, using that story to feel better about themselves. And now that story had crashed into reality and they were trying to blame me for the collision. He said I was being unreasonable, that I was letting anger cloud my judgment, that I was going to regret this when I calmed down and realized what I'd done to the family. I told them the bank deadline was in 4 days. They had until then to decide, either accept my offer to take over the loan with all the conditions that came with it, or deal with the bank themselves. Find another co-signer, come up with the money, figure it out. But they needed to decide because I was done with these conversations. They all started talking at once, arguing with me, with each other. My brother said I was being petty. My sister said I was punishing them for being honest. My uncle said I was destroying the family over pride. My mother kept crying. My father just stared at me like he couldn't believe his son had turned into someone he didn't recognize. But here's the thing. I am someone he doesn't recognize because he never actually knew me. None of them did. They knew the version of me they'd created, the disappointing son, the struggling brother, the family embarrassment. They'd loved that version because it made them feel superior, feel successful by comparison, feel justified in their own lives. And now that version was gone and they were meeting the real me for the first time. The me who'd quietly built a life while they weren't paying attention. The me who'd prepared for this exact moment. The me who wasn't going to roll over and accept their treatment just because blood is thicker than water. I told them to leave. They tried to keep arguing. I walked to the door and opened it. Said again, leave. Eventually they did. Filed out one by one. My sister was the last to go. She turned in the doorway and said I was going to regret this. That family was all we had and I was throwing it away over nothing. I closed the door. My hands were shaking. Not from fear or anxiety, from pure adrenaline. This was happening. This was real. They were finally seeing me, and they hated what they saw because it meant admitting they'd been wrong, admitting they'd created and destroyed a false version of me while ignoring who I actually was. The deadline is in 4 days. My phone has been silent since they left. No messages, no calls, nothing. They're either regrouping or they found another solution. Either way, I'm done waiting, done hoping they'll understand, done expecting them to acknowledge what they did. They want to save their business and their house. I'm offering them a way, but it comes with me having power, having control, having the ability to make them answer to me the way they made me answer to them for years, and they're realizing that might be worse than losing everything. Because losing everything means they're victims of circumstances. Accepting my help means admitting I was never the failure they needed me to be. 4 days left. Let's see what they choose. The deadline was Friday at 5 p.m. Thursday morning, my brother showed up at my workplace. I work in a regular office building downtown. Nothing fancy, but professional. He somehow found out where and just walked into the lobby. The receptionist called up to tell me my brother was downstairs demanding to see me. I told her to send him up to the conference room on the 2nd floor. Neutral space, glass walls, witnesses if things got heated. He came in looking exhausted, said we needed to talk before the deadline, that he'd been up all night thinking about this situation and he had a proposal. I sat down and waited. He said the family had been discussing options. They'd looked into other lenders. Tried to find alternative co-signers. Talked to lawyers about the co-signer agreement. None of it worked out. The bank wouldn't extend the deadline. Nobody else would take on that level of risk. The lawyers confirmed what my lawyer had told me about the transfer of obligation language, so they were stuck. They needed me, and my brother, being my brother, thought he could negotiate his way out of the conditions I'd set. He said they'd accept my help with the loan, but they wanted modifications. They'd agree to give me oversight on major business decisions, but not complete control. They'd put my name on the house, but as a junior lien holder, not equal ownership. They'd commit to paying me back on a structured timeline with interest. Basically, they wanted all the benefits of my help with none of the actual consequences. I asked him who came up with this proposal. He said he did, with input from my father and a lawyer they'd consulted. My mother and sister thought they should just accept my original terms, but my father refused. My father said he wasn't handing his life's work over to someone who clearly didn't respect the family. There it was. Even now, facing total financial collapse, my father's pride wouldn't let him accept that I had the power here, that I'd earned it, that his failure to take me seriously for 6 years had led directly to this moment. I told my brother no. The terms I offered were the terms. Take them or leave them. He said I was being unreasonable, that what I was demanding was essentially punishment disguised as help, that I was using their desperate situation to settle personal scores. I asked him if he thought they deserved better treatment than they'd given me. He said the party was one night. This was their entire lives. The loan situation was months of consequences for a few hours of jokes. The scale wasn't proportional. I asked him if he remembered the 6 years before the party. Every family dinner where they interrogated me about my failures. Every phone call where they lectured me about my choices. Every holiday where they used me as an example of what not to do with your life. I asked him if he remembered when my mother told her whole book club that I'd probably end up homeless, and she was preparing herself for that reality. If he remembered when my father said at Thanksgiving that at least my brother and sister had turned out right. My brother said families say harsh things sometimes. That parents worry, and it comes out wrong. That I was holding on to resentment instead of letting things go like a normal person would. Normal. He wanted me to be normal. To accept their treatment as normal family dynamics. To forgive without apology. To help without acknowledgement. To pretend the past 6 years hadn't happened because it was convenient for them now. I told him the deadline was tomorrow at 5. They could accept my terms by 4 p.m. and I'd have the paperwork ready. Otherwise, they'd be dealing with the bank alone. He asked what would happen if they refused. If they just let it all collapse? I said then they'd lose the business and likely the house. My father would have to declare bankruptcy. The business assets would be liquidated. The house would go into foreclosure since they'd refinanced it to fund the business expansion. They'd probably end up renting somewhere. Starting over at their age, he said I'd be affected too. The debt would hit my credit. I'd face consequences as the co-signer. I told him I'd already prepared for that. I had enough in savings and assets to weather it. My credit would take a hit, but I'd recover. The question was whether they could recover at their age with their financial situation. My brother stared at me, said he didn't recognize me anymore, that the brother he grew up with would never hold family hostage like this. I told him he never knew that brother. The brother he grew up with was too young and too naive to understand what this family really was. The person sitting across from him now had learned, had adapted, had become someone who couldn't be used and discarded. He left without another word. I went back to work, focused on my actual job. Let them sweat for another day. Friday morning, I got a text from my mother. Just said, please call me. I didn't. 2 p.m., my sister showed up at my building. The receptionist called again. I told her to tell my sister I was in meetings all day. She left a note. It said, we're going to accept your terms, but Mom wants to talk to you first. Please give her that much. 3 p.m., my father called. I answered. He said they were going to sign. They didn't have a choice. But he wanted me to understand what I was doing to the family. That this would destroy relationships that couldn't be repaired. That I was choosing money and control over blood. That he'd built that business for his family and I was taking it from him using legal technicalities. I asked him if he remembered co-signing the loan 8 years ago. If he remembered asking me for help. If he remembered me trusting him enough to put my name on his debt. He said that was different. That was family helping family when things were good between us. I said exactly. When things were good, When he thought I was someone worth respecting, he had no problem asking me for help. But the moment I struggled, the moment I wasn't useful anymore, I became the family joke, the cautionary tale, the disappointment. So now that our positions were reversed, now that he needed me and I didn't need him, he was experiencing what I'd lived with for 6 years. He said I'd become cruel. That whatever they'd done didn't justify this level of retaliation. I told him I wasn't retaliating. I was helping exactly the way they'd helped me, with conditions, with judgment, with constant reminders of my superior position. He hung up. 15 minutes later, my mother called. She was calmer than I expected. She said they were going to accept the terms, that my father was at the lawyer's office right now signing the preliminary paperwork, that they'd have everything ready for me to review by 4. She said she hoped I was happy, that I'd gotten what I wanted. I asked her what she thought I wanted. She said power over them, control, revenge for hurt feelings, the ability to feel superior after years of feeling inferior. I told her no. What I wanted was for them to see me. Actually see me. Not the version they'd created, not the story they'd told themselves, but the actual person I was, and the only way they'd ever see me was if I forced them to. If I made it impossible for them to ignore who I'd become. She asked if it was worth it. Destroying the family over pride. I said they destroyed the family years ago when they decided I was expendable, when they decided my struggles were entertainment, when they made me into something I wasn't because it was easier than accepting who I actually was. She said she didn't raise me to be like this. I told her she didn't raise me at all after I turned 30. She'd written me off, decided I was a failure, stopped seeing me as a son and started seeing me as a problem. So whoever I'd become, she had no claim to it. The paperwork arrived at 3:55, electronic signatures, all done through the lawyer's office. Transfer of loan obligation. My name added to business documentation as controlling stakeholder until debt satisfaction. Lien against the house in my name. Payment schedule with penalty clauses if they missed payments. All of it legal. All of it binding. I reviewed it with my lawyer on video call. Everything looked correct. I signed at 4:30. The business was now under my oversight. Any major decision required my approval. Any attempt to sell assets needed my signature. The house had my name attached to the deed with right of foreclosure if payments weren't made. My father's life's work was now legally tied to me until every cent was repaid with interest. And here's the best part, the part I'd been waiting for since I first got that call from the bank. The interest rate I'd negotiated was higher than the original loan. Legal, but aggressive. If they made minimum payments, it would take them 12 years to pay off. 12 years of me having control. 12 years of them having to answer to me. 12 years of them remembering that the son they'd mocked at their anniversary party was now the person who owned their financial future. That evening, I drove to the house. Their house. The one with my name on it now. I knocked. My father answered. Didn't invite me in, just stood in the doorway. I told him I wanted to do a walkthrough. Inspect the property that secured my investment. He said it wasn't necessary. I said, actually, it was. Part of the agreement gave me right to inspect the collateral. He could let me in voluntarily, or I could schedule it through the lawyer. He stepped aside. I walked through each room, the living room where they'd hosted countless family dinners, where I was the topic of concerned whispers. The kitchen, where my mother had made those phone calls to her friends talking about my failures. The den where my father had his office, where he'd built his business that I now controlled. My mother was sitting in the living room, didn't look at me. My sister was there too. She stared at me with pure hatred. My brother wasn't there. He'd apparently refused to come. Told them he wanted nothing to do with this. I finished my walkthrough. Told my father everything looked good, that I'd be requiring quarterly financial reports from the business, that any expenses over $5,000 needed my pre-approval, that if they missed a single payment, the penalties would be severe. He asked if I was enjoying this. I told him I was. That for 6 years I'd fantasized about a moment like this. A moment where they'd have to acknowledge me, have to respect me, have to treat me like someone who mattered. And now that moment was here, and it was exactly as satisfying as I'd imagined. My mother finally looked up, asked what I wanted from them. What would make this end? I said nothing would make it end. They'd created this situation by treating me like garbage while I quietly became someone they'd have to answer to. They'd bet against me at their anniversary party, $20 that I wouldn't show up. Well, I showed up, and I won. And the cost of losing wasn't $20. It was everything. My sister said I was destroying the family. I said no, I was holding them accountable. There's a difference. I left, drove home, sat in my condo, the one they just found out about, the life they just discovered I'd been living while they mocked a version of me that didn't exist. My phone hasn't stopped since then. Extended family members I haven't heard from in years, suddenly very concerned about family unity. Friends of my parents asking if we can work this out. Distant cousins weighing in on both sides. My aunt sent a long message about how I was punishing people who loved me. My uncle sent something about how I'd turned into someone ugly and vindictive. But here's what none of them understand. I didn't turn into this person. I was always this person. I just hid it while I built my life. While I prepared. While I waited for them to need me the way I'd once needed them. They humiliated me at their anniversary party because they thought I was powerless. Because they thought the disappointing son would just take it like he'd always taken it. Because they'd created this story about who I was and lived in it so comfortably they forgot it wasn't real. Now they know it wasn't real. Now they're living with the consequences of betting against me. And those consequences will last 12 years if they're lucky. Longer if they miss payments. Was it worth it? Yeah. Every single second. Because for the first time in 6 years, they're seeing me. Really seeing me. And they hate what they see because it means admitting they were wrong about everything. I walked into that anniversary party wearing a suit with a tag still on, playing their game one last time. I walked out knowing their world was about to collapse and mine was about to expand. They thought they were laughing at their disappointment. They were actually laughing at their own future. 36 and sleeping on a futon. Try 36 and holding the deed to your house. Still taking the bus? Try taking everything you built and putting my name on it. Unemployed again? Try employed as your new oversight. They all owe me a lot more than $20 now.